Panto was a radical Italian longshoreman active on the Brooklyn waterfront during the 1930s until the summer of 1939, when gangsters who controlled the International Longshoremen's Association in Brooklyn assassinated him. Panto's activities symbolized the culture of resistance and independent action of New York's dock workers against low wages and extremely poor working conditions. The shipping companies, with the collaboration of the gangster-dominated unions and New York's political structure, imposed these conditions on longshoremen. Panto's life and death illustrate the limitations placed on rank-and-file activity by the structures of power. The investigation into Pete Panto's activities explores the events that led up to his assassination and the repercussions following his death. A second aspect of this study examines the culture of independent rank-and-file action by which Panto's activity represented, and continued to influence the actions of future radicals on the Brooklyn waterfront. Independent rank-and-file activity on the Brooklyn waterfront in the 1930s was an extremely difficult endeavor. Not that it was any easier during other periods. Activists confronted simultaneously the union leadership led by Emil Camarda, vice president of the ILA, the shipping companies, and the local political structure represented by state and city politicians. It was an environment where a rebellious longshoreman could lose his livelihood or his life. The characteristics of waterfront unionism consisted of corruption, violence, and political patronage that left longshoremen to their own devices. Pete Panto's organizing activity did not go unnoticed by the union officials. At first, they tried to weaken the growing support for the reform movement by spreading the word. He's a Red, he's a radical, he'll get you and the union in trouble. When that failed, they tried to bribe him, and finally they resorted to threatening him. It was said that he often reacted by grinning at the gangsters who were sent to threaten him, and would continue to tell the dock workers, "We are strong, all we have to do is stand up and fight." One of the last such threats he received, rank-and-file activists reported, came shortly before his disappearance. Camarda told Panto, "The boys don't like what you're doing, so lay off." After returning from work on July 14, 1939 at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Panto seemed worried. Friends who saw him leave work declared that before going home, he confided that he was going to meet two guys that he didn't trust. Leaving his rented room at 11 North Elliott Place at 7 o'clock that evening, Pete told Michael Mafia, his fiance's brother, that if he didn't return by 10 o'clock the next morning, they should call the police. Pete Panto never returned home. The importance of the Pete Panto case was that for the first time, the notion of independent action and informal organization are combined simultaneously, giving the rank-and-file movement the unprecedented ability for the mobilization of dock workers outside of general movement for wage increases. The principal grievance of the rank-and-file committee was for democracy. Democracy for Panto and the rank-and-file committee could only be achieved by contesting the shape-up hiring system, which was a central mechanism that determined who controlled the waterfront. By contesting the existence of the shape-up, they not only questioned the very nature of the New York waterfront structure, but the relations of the gangster union officials to local political structure as well. At the same time, the assassination of Pete Panto was a message sent to all who attempted to organize New York's longshoremen. After Panto's death, the rank-and-file committee was quickly isolated. Hounded by gangsters, the committees received little solidarity from the surrounding community that supported Panto during the initial days of the Brooklyn campaign. Sam Medell, a longshore activist and contemporary of Pete Panto, recalled the community's reaction to Panto's assassination. The Brooklyn waterfront was terrified. The doors that were open to me previously were closed. You couldn't get anyone to talk. Most of their political support after Panto's death came from the progressives outside of the Red Hook neighborhood. If the mass mobilization among dock workers was unprecedented, it was also a turning point in consolidating the relationship between employers, the local political structure, and the union leadership, who continuously struggled to control the rebellious culture of New York's longshoremen, and particularly the predominantly Italian dock workers of Brooklyn. As late as 1979, remembering the 40th anniversary of the assassination of Pete Panto, the rank-and-file newsletter, Dockers News, wrote, "Pete Panto spoke with an accent, but all longshoremen understood him. Pete Panto paid with his life. Others who came after him carried on the fight. Guys like Sampson on the west side, who led the fight against Joe Ryan. Joe Banks, Cleo and Adronicus Jacobs from Local 986. Black brothers who fought discrimination and Joe Ryan's one-man rule. Fred Lazecki and Honest Abe from Local 8 in Brooklyn on the Bush and Green docks. Pete Panto left a legacy of rank-and-file fighters. A true son of the Italian working class, his spirit carries on.
There's no separation, and I think William Mello makes that point very clear, but there's no separation between the dual purposes that Pete Panto had. That to get rid of racketeering, you also had to get rid of the shape-up. That the concern of Panto was equally to get rid of the racketeers as it was to democratize the Union. Pete Panto is in the tradition of rank-and-file movements, which are not just movements against the corporation, in this sense the shipping companies, but is often against the Union, and that's a long history. The radicals do not believe that they can become the major force in politics of the local, but see themselves functioning in a watchdog role. They continually hope to dramatize issues that are important to longshoremen through election campaigns and wildcat strikes. They function as a check on the excesses of the Union, the shipping companies, and the Waterfront Commission. I think that's enough. I think that in these very conservative times, that one of the other successful realities of the bombing of the Trade Center and the Pentagon is that workers all around the country are going to be told they cannot strike for higher wages. We have to stand in the spirit of Peter Panto for the continued right to strike.
The magic is that the Italian longshoremen were willing to stand up and fight, despite the fact that they had the worst kind of worker oppression, as far as I know, in the United States. In that, the waterfront is a fantastically rich gold mine for the gangsters. It isn't the $2 that the kickback guy pays, that the worker pays, that puts money, makes it so profitable for the gangsters. No, it is the fact that they could negotiate contracts with the shipping companies. They themselves got kickbacks from the shipping companies to make lousy contracts. And another thing that's often ignored, millions, hundreds of millions of dollars went into the pockets of the gangsters through what we call pilferage. A pilferage ordinarily means the workers break open a case of whiskey, they take a bottle, and that's pilferage. My foot, pilferage meant you take the whole ship, literally. And the tribute, when you talk about Pete, don't just talk about Pete. It's the Italian-American peasants from Italy who couldn't speak English, but they remember La Lega dei Contadini, the League of the country trying to abolish the shape of the house, and they surrounded Pete, and they were the movement. Pete emerged from that tradition and had the strength to be that leader. And why he influenced me, my father, and Pete, is because I asked myself, would I do what Pete did? I don't know. The spirit of Pete Panto, the words and the name Pete Panto may disappear in time. But God bless Pete, that miserable, crazy man who had the courage to say to the evil fascists, bastards, fuck you.